Today on The Secret Case, we explore the life of Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker. A serial killer who terrorized Southern California during the 1980s, his actions left an indelible mark on American criminal history. In this video, we'll review his childhood, the crimes he committed, how he was caught, and the impact he left on society. How did a young man with such a complicated life become one of the most feared figures of his time? Before we start, make sure you subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our videos about the most shocking cases in criminal history. Let's go! Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He grew up in a large family with 5 siblings, in a home marked by poverty and instability. From a young age, Richard lived through disturbing experiences that shaped his future life. His father, a former police officer, was violent and often abusive. Richard sought refuge in his older brother and cousin, both of whom had troubled backgrounds. One of the key events in his childhood was his relationship with his cousin, Mike, a Vietnam War veteran who was said to have taught him about violence and mistreatment of other human beings. Cousin Mike also showed him disturbing images of his time in the war, which greatly influenced Richard's young mind. Adding to this influence was the substance abuse that Richard began doing from an early age, which impaired his sense of reality. At 17, Richard left his home in El Paso and moved to Los Angeles, looking to escape his family life and start over. However, instead of finding stability, he sank deeper into drug use and crime. The streets of Los Angeles became his new home, and there he began to commit crimes, from petty theft to much more violent acts. During his youth, Richard also developed a fascination with horror music and films. The lyrics of bands such as AC/DC and the dark themes of horror films influenced his perception of the world, contributing to his penchant for chaos and destruction. This interest in evil and the supernatural was undoubtedly a major component in the creation of his future criminal persona. The 1980s in California were a time of fear and uncertainty, largely due to the series of crimes perpetrated by Richard Ramirez. His nickname, the Night Stalker, was earned by his tendency to enter his victims' homes at night while they were sleeping. He used the darkness as his ally, moving silently, taking advantage of open windows or poorly closed doors. Between 1984 and 1985, Richard committed at least 14 murders in California, targeting both men and women of different ages and social backgrounds. His crimes were particularly brutal, and the way he chose his victims seemed completely random, which generated widespread terror in the population. This unpredictability made him even more terrifying, as no one knew when or where he would strike next. Richard also gained the trust of his victims before entering their homes, allowing him to carry out his crimes with surprising cold-bloodedness. He often left symbols and messages at the scene of the crime, revealing not only his disregard for human life, but also a penchant for chaos and destruction. Some of these symbols included references to occult themes, adding a level of mystery to his modus operandi and making him an even more feared and studied figure. One of the most disturbing aspects of his modus operandi was that he did not limit himself to one particular type of attack. Richard did not discriminate based on age, gender, or social class, which defied common stereotypes about serial killers. This lack of a pattern was one of the reasons why authorities had such a hard time identifying and stopping him. Furthermore, on many occasions, he left his victims alive, allowing him to extend his trail of terror for months. As his crimes continued, the LAPD and FBI intensified their search. One of the key elements to his capture was a fingerprint he left on one of the stolen vehicles, linked to one of the crime scenes. This evidence led to Ramirez's identification, and soon his face was all over the media. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez was captured in an unusual way. He had been out of town for a while, but upon returning to Los Angeles, he was unaware that his face was on the front pages of newspapers. He entered a store to buy supplies and was recognized by the customers. As he tried to flee, he was stopped by a group of neighbors who recognized him and subdued him until the police arrived. This capture, curiously, was not the direct work of the police, but of the community itself, which, tired of fear and insecurity, decided to act on its own. This event reflected the level of terror that Ramirez had sown in Los Angeles society. An interesting aspect of his capture was his reaction. Unlike many other criminals, Richard showed no surprise or regret when he was apprehended. He seemed to have accepted his fate with an eerie calm, leading many to speculate about his mental state at the time. Upon being taken to the police station, he reportedly declared with a smile, "I knew I would be caught." Richard Ramirez's trial began in 1989 and was one of the most publicized in recent history. His behavior during the trial only increased his reputation as a remorseless criminal. He smiled, made threatening gestures to the jurors, and mocked the victims and their families. In addition, during the trial, his fascination with the occult and dark symbols was revealed, which he himself had used in several of his crime scenes. Throughout the trial, Ramirez displayed a defiant and arrogant attitude, even openly declaring his allegiance to what he considered dark forces. This led to many viewing him as an almost demonic figure, which increased the myth surrounding him. He was eventually found guilty of 13 murders, among other charges, and sentenced to death on death row at San Quentin. During the trial, numerous witnesses offered chilling details about Ramirez's crimes, and the defendant himself seemed to enjoy the limelight. It was not uncommon to see him laughing or making disparaging remarks toward the victims' families. This attitude only increased the public perception that Richard was someone completely devoid of empathy or remorse. The trial was so high-profile that dozens of people came to the courtroom daily, and the media covered every moment in detail. Richard Ramirez spent more than 2 decades on death row, where he continued to receive media attention. His case inspired numerous documentaries, books, and films, making him one of the most well-known serial killers in popular culture. The image of the Night Stalker remains a reminder of the fear that an unscrupulous criminal can instill. Throughout his imprisonment, Richard continued to receive letters from admirers and, shockingly, he married one of his followers in 1996. This fact shows how Ramirez's figure came to attract even people who saw in him something beyond his crimes. His fascination with evil and his lack of remorse continued to be subjects of interest to psychologists, criminologists, and the press. This phenomenon, where notorious killers receive the admiration and support of outsiders, is something that has been observed with other criminals, but in Ramirez's case it reached an unusual level. Some experts have argued that his charisma and physical appearance played a role in this attraction. Despite the horrors he committed, for some, he represented an almost rebellious figure, which has been the subject of analysis and debate in criminal psychology. Ramirez eventually passed away in 2013, at the age of 53, while awaiting execution. He died from complications related to cancer, leaving behind a history marked by violence, fear, and darkness. Although his life is over, his legacy as one of America's most notorious killers remains studied and debated to this day. Richard Ramirez's story is a mix of disturbing family influences, early violence, and a mind bent on chaos. The Night Stalker is remembered not only for the terrible crimes he committed, but also for the way he spread fear in one of the largest cities in the world. He remains a symbol of remorseless evil, and his case a reminder of how darkness can dwell even in the most unexpected places. Over the years, his story has been the subject of multiple psychological analyses, attempting to decipher what led him to commit his atrocities. The combination of childhood trauma, substance abuse, and exposure to violence seems to have been key in his transformation. What do you think about Richard Ramirez's case? Do you think the circumstances of his life led him down that path, or was it a completely conscious decision? Leave us your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more criminal cases and in-depth analysis.